The wind was a low, groaning thing that moved across the land like sorrow looking for somewhere to settle. Snow dusted the barren fields in thin, uneven sheets, less like a blanket, more like ash after a fire. The barn stood squat and gray at the edge of the pasture, half swallowed by the early dusk. The fences had been broken since October, the cattle gone since March. The man who owned it all sat hunched on the porch, a wool coat over his shoulders, his face worn as old leather, hands motionless on his knees. His name was Eli Cade, though no one had said it out loud in weeks. Not since the funeral. Not since the coughing fits turned to silence and the woman he buried in the orchard behind the house stopped haunting his dreams. The world had kept turning anyway, but not here, not on his land. The house no longer smelled of wood smoke and bread. It smelled like cold and dried mud, and the dust that rose when you opened a drawer that hadn't been touched in years. He'd just come in from feeding the horses or what was left of them, and he wasn't sure what pulled his eyes to the barn. It might have been the way the shadows moved. Or didn't. Or maybe it was the wind pausing a second too long. The animals had all been sold or eaten. The doors had been latched since the storm last month. And yet, he stood, slow. The weight of the cold made his joints crackle. He grabbed the rifle out of instinct. Not for use, just to feel something heavy in his hands that still belonged to him. The snow crunched as he walked. He hadn't heard his own footsteps in days. When he pushed the barn door open, the hinges groaned like they remembered what it was to protest. At first, he saw nothing. Just old tools, broken harnesses, the faint imprint of hay bales long since gone. Then, near the back wall, a small shift in shape. A cough. Not loud, not panicked. Just small. Eli stopped. They were curled like foxes, tucked into themselves under what looked like a horse blanket and some grain sacks. A girl, maybe 12, maybe younger. A boy, knees drawn up, face hidden. 4 more bodies, smaller. One was a baby, still wrapped in something blue. They didn't wake, not even when he stepped closer. Then he saw the bag. It was canvas, dirt-streaked and torn at the seams. He wouldn't have thought anything of it if the flap hadn't been open, and if there hadn't been that letter sticking out, creased, crumpled, but still dry. His fingers reached for it like they already knew. The paper shook in his hands as he read. The words weren't elegant. They were scrawled in a hand that was trying not to shake. If you find them, please don't turn them out. Their daddy's gone. I'm not far behind. We've no one left. The girl knows how to care for the rest. Please, I beg you, don't send them back to the law. They've had enough of strangers. He read it twice, then 3 times. The cold seemed to press in tighter around his ribs. His legs almost buckled then. He didn't cry. That had dried up months ago. But something cracked behind his eyes, something that had stayed frozen longer than the winter. The girl stirred, opened her eyes. Dark, sharp eyes like his wife's had been when she was angry or scared. She didn't scream, didn't speak, just looked at him, then at the rifle, then back to him. She sat up slowly, cradling the baby closer. I ain't stealin', she whispered, voice hoarse. We just needed a night out of the wind. We'll go. He said nothing. He couldn't. He stared at the girl, the way her hands moved like she'd done this too many times before. The baby squirmed in her arms, but didn't cry. None of them did. He lowered the rifle. You ain't going nowhere, he said at last, voice barely a breath. And with that, he turned and walked back to the house. It took her a long minute, but she followed. All of them did. Like shadows peeling off the walls, they gathered their things, what little they had, and stepped into the snow. The wind kicked up, but not enough to hide the 6 sets of footsteps trailing behind him. The front door groaned when he opened it. The stove was dead, the air inside colder than outside, but it was shelter. The girl paused in the doorway, waiting for permission. He nodded once. She stepped in. The others followed like a flock of birds unsure where to land. He lit the stove. It took longer than it should have. The kindling was damp, his hands stiff, but he got it burning. When the light hit their faces, he saw them more clearly. Pale, hollow-eyed, the youngest still sucking sleep from his fists. He brought out the last of the cornbread, poured warm water in tin mugs, watched as they ate without looking up. When the girl thanked him, it was barely above a whisper. He just nodded again, because if he tried to speak, he didn't know what would come out. The next morning came in blue and brittle. Frost webbed the inside of the windows, and the fire had burned down to embers. Eli woke in his chair by the stove, a quilt he didn't remember fetching draped over his lap. The children were scattered across the floor like fallen birds, curled up in nests of coats and feed sacks. The girl was already up. She stood near the back door, staring out at the fields as if she'd been waiting for the sun. Her arms were crossed tight, her shoulders squared, like she was bracing for someone to tell her it was time to move on. Eli cleared his throat. She turned, her eyes sharp with that same stillness from the night before. "Name's Ruth," she said before he could ask. "They're my brothers and sisters. The baby's Thomas. The others are Sammy, Nora, Jude, and Clara." Eli nodded once. "Eli," he said, "this is my place, I figured." She looked around the room. "You got a wife?" He didn't answer, just pushed himself up from the chair and walked to the stove. He'd been a rancher long enough to know the language of silence. He cracked open the door, fed in wood, and let the flames catch. Behind him, Ruth didn't press. The day moved slow, as all cold days do. Ruth helped carry in wood. She swept the porch with a broken broom without being asked. The littlest ones were quiet, eyes tracking Eli's movements like animals unsure whether the new land would kill them or keep them. By afternoon, Eli had set a pot of beans on to boil. The smell filled the room in a way that made him ache. He watched as the children gathered near the stove, not quite touching anything, not quite relaxing. The boy called Sammy, maybe 7, looked like he wanted to ask 100 questions but didn't dare. "You got schoolin'?" Eli asked. Ruth nodded. "Some. Mama taught us out of the Bible and whatever books we had. We can read, write a little." "Where's your people from?" She shrugged. "Started in Oklahoma. Been moving since Daddy got sick. Worked fields, picked cotton. Mama died 3 weeks back, near Riverton." 3 weeks? Eli stared at her. She didn't flinch. "We walked most the way. Took rides when folks offer. Last man dropped us 2 towns east. Said the law wouldn't care for more mouths." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Just ladled beans into bowls and handed them out. The baby fussed while they ate. Ruth bounced him on her hip, not missing a bite. She moved like someone twice her age, calm, efficient, her eyes never leaving the others for long. When Sammy spilled his beans, she didn't scold. Just scooped them back into the bowl and handed it to him again. Later, while the children slept, Eli sat on the porch and watched the light die. It had been months since anyone had filled the silence in that house. Months since footsteps echoed down that hallway. He wasn't sure what this was, charity, madness, penance, but he didn't want it to end. Not yet. He heard the creak of the door behind him. Ruth stepped out, pulling the quilt tight around her. "I can work," she said. "I ain't afraid of it. We'll help. We can pull our weight." "I know," he said. "I mean it. You don't gotta keep us." He looked at her then. Really looked. She had her mother's hands, probably. Strong, cracked from wind and washwater. Her face still round in places, but her eyes were hard. She had already lost more than most men twice his age. "You hungry?" She blinked, confused. "No, sir. I ate." "I mean in life," he said. "You hungry for something more?" Her face twitched, just once. "I don't know what more looks like." He nodded. "Reckon we'll find out." She was quiet a long time. The wind kicked up, blowing snow across the yard in fine ribbons. "We can help with the horses," she said finally. "Jude's good with animals. Sammy too. You ever muck a stall?" "Plenty." "All right then." They stood in silence, staring out at the fields. The land looked dead, but Eli knew it was only sleeping. He felt something stir in his chest, a dull, warm ache, like fire catching on wet wood. He wasn't sure if it was hope or just the memory of it, but he didn't send them away. Not that day, not the next. By the end of the week, the ranch was breathing again. Boot prints tracked through the frost near the pump. Wash hung stiff on the line, clapping like bones in the wind. The barn, which had been silent for nearly a year, now echoed with the scrape of pitchforks and the rustle of hay. Jude had taken to the old mule like they were cousins, brushing her coat with a gentleness that didn't match his dirt-caked nails. Sammy, always watching, started mimicking his older brother's movements until he could bridle and lead without being told. Ruth rose before Eli most mornings. She had taken it upon herself to sweep the kitchen floor, clean the lamp glass, warm the milk on the stove. She cooked without being asked, and though the meals were thin, they had taste now. salt, onion, the smell of cornmeal frying in lard. It made Eli forget, just for a few minutes, that the house had once been quiet as a grave. But the past didn't stay buried. He caught himself, more than once, reaching for a voice that was no longer there. His wife, Lena, had filled this house with songs, soft, off-key things she hummed while she worked. Sometimes he heard it still, between the creak of floorboards and the rattle of stove lids. Other times, it was Ruth's voice in the next room, calming the baby, and it hit him like a slap. The way she cooed, the way she said, "Hush now," with that same weary tenderness Lena used when her body started to fail but her love hadn't. That ache behind his ribs, it hadn't gone away. It had just learned to settle in quieter. He didn't ask Ruth more about the letter. He didn't need to. Whatever had driven her across miles of empty road, through towns that turned away hungry eyes, had forged her into something flinty and fierce. She didn't talk much, but when she did, it mattered. Like when she stood beside him at the fence line one morning, cheeks red with cold, eyes fixed on the broken post he'd been meaning to fix since last spring. "You gonna patch that?" she asked. He grunted. Eventually, she nudged a shovel toward him with her boot. Now's eventually. He didn't argue. And somehow, she ended up beside him, sleeves rolled, fingers wrapped around the post-hole digger, working in silence like they'd done it 100 times before. That night, Eli pulled out the box. He hadn't opened it since the funeral. It was a dull pine chest, plain, nailed shut after Lena passed. Inside was the quilt she'd been working on when the fever took her. Pieces of flannel, some cut from their boys' shirts. She'd lost both sons in the war. After that, she'd sewn in silence, every stitch a prayer she no longer believed in. He carried it into the living room and laid it over Ruth while she dozed near the fire. She startled, waking quick, always alert. "I don't need," she began. "It was hers," he said. "She'd want you to have it." Ruth touched the fabric like it might vanish. "It's too nice." He didn't reply, just moved back to the chair and sat down. The fire crackled. The baby stirred, then settled. Jude snored softly in the corner. It was the kind of night that used to be a burden. Now it felt like something else. Not joy. Not yet. But warmth. He didn't ask for it, but it came anyway. The next day, Ruth took the baby out on her hip and showed Clara how to scatter feed to the chickens. The boy, Sammy, asked Eli if he knew how to build a sled, said he wanted to drag Jude through the snow till spring came. Eli looked at the boy's skinny arms, the makeshift boots, the way his nose ran constantly. "You build it," Eli said. "I'll show you how to keep it from falling apart." The boy's grin was crooked, gap-toothed. It broke something loose in Eli's chest. They spent the afternoon in the barn, sawing old lumber, arguing over nail lengths, measuring with twine and hope. Eli hadn't laughed in over a year. He did that day, just once, when the sled collapsed under its own ambition and Sammy declared it still good for hauling firewood if not for hauling Jude. Ruth watched them from the doorway, arms folded, something unreadable in her face. "You keep on," she said, voice soft. "You'll spoil 'em. They could use a little spoilin'." She didn't smile, not exactly, but her shoulders loosened. Her gaze softened, and for the first time in a long time, Eli Cade felt like a man who might still have something to give. March came with thaw and thunder. The snow melted slow, revealing the bones of winter-broken tools, half-frozen feed sacks, hoof prints long since turned to ice. The creek behind the barn swelled and roared with spring runoff. The earth, once rigid with cold, turned soft and dark, like a bruise healing from the inside out. Eli found himself waking earlier, not from habit but because something in him wanted to see what each day brought. The kids had carved out routines without asking. Jude and Sammy did the morning chores. Clara, all of 6, followed them like a pup, dragging a too-large pail behind her. Nora, quiet and round-eyed, took to the chickens with a calm Eli couldn't explain. Ruth had all of them whipped into rhythm, a kind of order that didn't rely on raised voices or hard hands. They reminded him of Lena, not in how they looked, but in how they held the house together with nothing but will and motion. One afternoon, Eli found Ruth in the field, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hacking weeds from the fence line. Her hands were blistered. The wind had turned her cheeks raw, but she didn't stop when he called. "Ruth." She paused, wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. You don't have to do all this. She looked at him. If we don't, who will? He stepped closer. You're a girl. Her jaw tightened. Not anymore. They stood there a moment. Her eyes flashed, but not in defiance. In something harder, something earned. You got any dreams? He asked, surprising himself. Dreams? You know. Something you want, that ain't food or sleep or dry socks. She looked away. I used to want to be a teacher. He nodded. You still could, she scoffed. We got no money. I didn't ask what you got. I asked what you want. Silence hung between them. Maybe someday, she said, voice barely above the wind. They walked back toward the house together, wordless, but the air had changed. Lighter. Not soft, but not as sharp. Later that week, a letter came. Eli found it in the box down by the road, hand-delivered by the same mail carrier who hadn't come in over a month. The man gave him a long look, like he knew something, like he'd heard something in town. The envelope had no return address, just a name. Mrs. Langley, Kansas County Child Welfare. Eli read it twice before he sat down. Then once more after he poured a cup of black coffee that went untouched. They knew. Someone had seen the kids. Word had gotten back. Maybe from the feed store. Maybe from the postmaster. Didn't matter. They were coming. Ruth stood in the doorway when he came back inside, eyes locked on the envelope in his hand. They found us, she said. Eli didn't ask how she knew. She just did. What are you going to do? She asked. The question was simple. The weight behind it wasn't. He looked at the kid Sammy racing Jude across the pasture, Nora stringing beads on a cord of twine, Clara sitting beside the fire, showing the baby how to blow raspberries with his lips. The house no longer felt like his. It felt alive again. I'm going to tell 'em they're mine, he said. Ruth blinked. I'll lie if I have to, he added. I'll fight 'em if it comes to that. But you're not leaving. Not unless you walk out of your own choosing. She stared at him, not blinking, not breathing. Then she looked down at the floor and said nothing, but her shoulders dropped. Her fists unclenched. That night, after the kids were asleep, Ruth sat by the fire, the quilt Lena made stretched across her lap. I didn't think anyone would want us, she said, voice quiet. Eli didn't move from his chair. You're not a burden, he said. You're a damn miracle. Outside, the rain started again, soft, rhythmic, steady as breath. The land would grow green soon. He could feel it underfoot. New shoots waiting to rise. The welfare woman arrived on a Tuesday, just before supper, driving a mud-slicked government car that looked out of place on Eli's land. Her boots were polished. Her coat was stiff wool. She carried a clipboard in one hand like a badge. Her name was Mrs. Langley, and her eyes didn't miss much. Eli met her at the gate, hat low over his brow. You must be Mr. Cade, she said, stepping carefully over the wet ruts. We received word there are minors living on this property. You received wrong, he said, not smiling. She raised an eyebrow. So you're saying there are no children here? I'm saying they're not stray dogs. They're my family. She tilted her head. You're listed as widowed. No surviving children. I said family, he replied. Didn't say blood. She studied him a long moment. The wind picked up. A crow called from the fence post and got no answer. I'd like to see the children. He didn't move. They're not exhibits. She narrowed her eyes. Mr. Cade, I can come back with a sheriff. And I can come back with a shotgun, he said, voice flat. Something in her face cracked at that, not fear. Not quite, but the realization that this man wasn't going to fold like others had. But then, behind him, the door creaked open. Ruth stepped out, baby on her hip. Her dress was patched, her boots muddy, but her chin was high, and her spine was straight as fence wire. They're here, she said. You want to see us? Come on in. Mrs. Langley hesitated, then walked up the porch steps, glancing around as if trying to catch a lie before it settled. Inside, the house smelled of stew and smoke. Nora was braiding Clara's hair near the stove. Jude and Sammy sat at the table with spoons in hand, already squabbling over who'd get the last biscuit. The baby gurgled and reached for Mrs. Langley's brooch with fat, determined fingers. These children have names? The woman asked, flipping a page on her clipboard. They do, Ruth said, calm. Same ones we've always had. And Mr. Cade has been caring for you? Better than any bloodkin we ever had, Ruth said, without looking at Eli. The woman's eyes flicked from face to face. I'll need to confirm all this with the county. Eli crossed his arms. You do that. But know this. If you come back here to take him, you best bring an army. Mrs. Langley sighed. It's not that simple, Mr. Cade. It is to me. There was silence then. Heavy. The kind that sits in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Mrs. Langley scribbled something, tucked her pen behind her ear. I'll be in touch, she said, then turned and walked out, her boots thudding across the porch with tight clipped steps. Ruth didn't speak, just rocked the baby, gently. The others didn't ask what had happened. Maybe they knew better than to hope too fast. Eli stood by the window until the car disappeared over the ridge. That night, they ate in silence. Not tense, just waiting. After supper, Ruth came to him while he was smoking his pipe on the porch. You meant what you said? She asked. He looked up at her. Every word. She nodded once. Then I guess we stay. And that was that. The next week brought warmer days. Buds appeared on the trees. The ground softened underfoot. Eli started plowing again. Sammy ran beside the mule, shouting like it was a race. Jude walked behind, tossing seed with care. The girls helped Ruth boil lye for soap, hung laundry like flags across the yard. Eli watched them and felt something shift inside a slow, quiet bloom. Not joy exactly, but peace. Maybe the two weren't so different. One evening, Ruth brought him a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was the letter, the one he'd found in their bag. I don't need it anymore, she said. You sure? She nodded. It got us here. That's all it had to do. He didn't ask if she wanted him to burn it or keep it. He just took it and placed it back in the box with Lena's quilt, where old things could rest. Later, he fixed the broken swing on the porch. Clara was the first to test it. Her laughter rang out over the fields, bright and wild. Ruth sat beside him, elbows on her knees, watching the sun sink behind the hill. She'd like this, she said. Who? Your wife. Eli looked at the girl, now a woman in all but years. Yeah, he said. I reckon she would. The land was healing. The house was full. And for the first time in a long time, Eli Cade believed in tomorrow. Spring turned the land soft and green, carving color back into the world like a painter with a slow, steady hand. Wildflowers pushed up between fence posts. The orchard behind the house began to blossom, those first shy petals opening like prayers answered too late. The children's boots tracked mud instead of frost now. The air smelled of rain and new hay. Eli kept busy. He had to. The weight in his chest had lightened, but it still sat there like a stone that had forgotten why it was angry. Most days, the work filled that space before the sorrow had time to find it. The plow still dragged. The mules still fought the reins. But the fields were turning again, and that was enough. The kids fell into the rhythm of ranch life, like they'd been born to it. Sammy got taller, bolder. Once, Eli found him halfway up the windmill, grinning like a fool. Ruth chewed him out so hard he didn't look anyone in the eye for an hour. Jude started carving things, little animals, mostly from scrap wood. Quiet, intricate work. Nora and Clara stuck close to the kitchen, where Ruth taught them to knead bread with their elbows and measure by palm. The baby, Thomas, learned to walk across that wide kitchen floor, staggering from chair to table like a drunk old man, giggling with each fall. Eli watched it all and thought maybe this was what grace looked like. Not a sermon, not a miracle, just a family stumbling their way into a life they never expected. Then came the letter. Again, different handwriting this time. Not from the county, from someone else. Ruth was the one who opened it. Her hands didn't shake, but her face turned hard as stone. She read it 3 times before she said anything. Eli waited. It's from my uncle, she said finally. Daddy's brother. Says he just heard what happened. Wants to talk things through. Eli didn't say a word, just stared at the paper in her hand. He's got a farm, she added. Wheat. Wants to take us in. You believe him? Ruth laughed, bitter and sharp. I remember him. Drank more than he worked. Hit my aunt so hard once she lost hearing in one ear. Eli stood. Then it ain't a choice, but she shook her head. It is. He studied her. You thinking about it? She didn't answer right away. Her fingers twisted the corner of the letter. I ain't never had a real home, she said finally. Not like this. But he's blood. If I say no, I'm the one slamming a door that might never open again. Eli felt the old dread rising, the ache that came before absence. He wanted to grab her by the shoulders and say, you're home now. But he didn't. He'd buried too many people to think love was something you could claim just by wanting it bad enough. That night, he found her outside under the orchard trees, the blossoms falling like snow in the moonlight. She didn't turn when he came. "I was gonna leave," she said, voice low. "First week we got here, I was gonna take the kids and go." "I know." She turned. "You did? I seen it in your eyes. Same look Lena had when her mama died. That look that says the world don't owe you a damn thing, and you ain't waitin' to be disappointed." They stood in silence. "What changed?" he asked. "You," she said. "This place. The way you never once made us feel like we didn't belong." He stepped closer. "So what now?" She folded the letter in half, then in half again, then tore it into pieces, slow and quiet. "I choose here," she said, "not 'cause it's safe, 'cause it's ours." Eli felt something swell in his chest, raw, clean, painful in the best way. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. They walked back to the house together, the light in the windows waiting like a promise kept. That night, they sat around the table, Ruth at one end, Eli at the other, the children in between. No one said much. No one had to. The fire crackled. The baby slept in Eli's arms. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like an old hymn. He looked across the table at the girl who'd once stood in his barn with a letter in her hand and nothing left to lose. Now she was home. They all were. Summer arrived like it had been holding its breath, all spring hot, thick, relentless. The kind of heat that baked the dirt into cracks and pulled sweat from your back before the sun even cleared the ridge. The grass turned gold. The creek slowed to a trickle. But the land was working again, and so were they. Eli woke each morning to the sound of dishes clinking, and Ruth humming low while she worked, the tune shapeless but steady. It wasn't Lena's song, but it was something close, warm, lived in. The boys worked beside him in the fields now. Sammy with more heart than sense. Jude with the quiet, focused strength of someone twice his age. The girls tended the garden like it was sacred ground. Ruth had taught them to plant in rows, and for the first time in years, the soil gave back. The days passed in sweat and dust and sunburns. Nights came with laughter card games on the porch. Nora's knock-knock jokes that made no sense but made Clara cackle anyway. Eli kept the fire pit going some nights, roasting what they had, watching the kids chase fireflies till their feet gave out. He never told them to be quiet. The sound of them, their joy, was the one thing he never wanted to hush. But the future had a way of showing up, uninvited. It came one evening when Ruth found Eli in the barn, checking the harnesses before the next day's ride into town. "You got a minute?" she asked. He wiped his hands and nodded. She held a letter. Not torn, not angry, just folded neat and tight. "I've been thinking," she said, "about school." Eli looked at her, waiting. "I want to go," she said. "Not now, not yet. But someday, finish what I started. Maybe teach, like I dreamed." He nodded. "You should." "I'll need help," she added. "Books, maybe a tutor. I don't even know what townfolk charge for that." "I'll find out." She looked away, fingers tightening on the letter. "It'll take money. Time. I'd be gone part of the week. You sure you want that? A girl with big plans and half a dozen siblings." He stepped forward, took the letter from her hand, set it on the workbench. "I want whatever brings you peace," he said. Her eyes welled up then, fast and sudden. She looked down, but he didn't move. He just stood there, letting her have that moment. "You're more of a father than I ever had," she whispered. Eli swallowed hard. "And you're more of a daughter than I ever deserved." They didn't hug. It wasn't like that. But when she walked back out into the dying sun, something had changed between them, something final and good. That week, he sold the last of Lena's jewelry. It wasn't much: a gold ring, a thin chain, a locket with the boys' baby photos still inside. He'd kept it all in a box he never opened. He brought it into town and handed it to a shopkeeper without a word. Ruth never asked where the money came from. She just used it to buy used textbooks, notebooks, pencils. She built a little shelf in the corner of the living room, and one by one the books filled it. In late August, she registered for classes in a neighboring town. Twice a week, she rode the mule into the valley, caught a ride with the grocer's wife, and sat in the back of a community center learning algebra and geography. She came back each time glowing, exhausted, ink-stained, hungry but glowing all the same. And somehow, the house still ran. The children pitched in without needing to be told. Clara learned to boil eggs without cracking them. Jude handled the fence repairs. Sammy took charge of kindling, hauling logs so heavy he limped by the end of the day. Eli taught them all what he could, but it was Ruth's example that kept them pushing. One evening, after the dishes were done and the sun had long since dropped behind the hill, Ruth found Eli out in the orchard. The trees were heavy, with fruit now sweet, late apples with a bite to them. "I got a letter from the school today," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "They want me to come back next term. Said I've got promise." She smiled, then sobered. "Said I could even test for a teaching certificate within the year if I wanted bad enough." "You do?" "I think I do," she said. "But I won't go if it means leaving them, the kids, you." Eli picked an apple, handed it to her. "You're not leaving," he said. "You're growing. There's a difference." She turned the apple in her hands, nodded. "And when I get that certificate?" she asked. "We'll build a schoolhouse right here," he said. "Teach our own. Maybe a few neighbor kids, too." She smiled at that, big and real. "You serious?" "As a damn heart attack." They laughed. Then, standing under the heavy-limbed trees, the air rich with late summer heat and the scent of ripening things, the orchard had grown quiet again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of beginnings. Winter came slower than expected that year. The first snow didn't fall until late November, and even then it was more a dusting than a storm, just enough to powder the roof and line the fence posts like chalk. The children stood at the windows, noses pressed to the glass, waiting for it to deepen. It didn't. Not yet. But the cold came anyway, sharp and biting, turning the dirt roads slick and the breath visible in the early mornings. Inside, the ranch held warmth. Eli had spent the fall stockpiling firewood and canning what Ruth and the girls had pulled from the garden. The cellar was full now, rows of potatoes, sealed jars of tomatoes, green beans, even apple butter they'd cooked down for hours with cinnamon from a tin so old the label had peeled away. He wasn't used to plenty. It felt strange, not unwelcome, just unfamiliar. The children grew stronger by the week. Clara had lost the wobble in her step. Jude had started speaking more, asking questions about livestock, crop rotation, the price of feed. Sammy had turned 8 and demanded a chore chart, which he then abandoned by day 3. Even Nora, shy as a field mouse, had begun humming under her breath when she swept. And Ruth had changed most of all. She carried herself taller now, like someone who had chosen her place in the world rather than accepted it out of desperation. Her eyes were still sharp, but not hard. Her laughter came easier. And when she read to the younger ones by lantern light books from her night classes, poems and old readers from back before things went bad, Eli often found himself standing in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt. Sometimes he swore Lena was there in the shadows, listening too. One morning in December, Eli came in from the barn to find Ruth standing by the stove, holding something in her hand, a small box, not new, worn, with a brass hinge and no lock. He recognized it immediately. "Where'd you find that?" "In the cupboard, behind the old flour sack." He nodded. "Lena's. She kept keepsakes." Ruth opened the box slowly, reverently. Inside was a lace handkerchief, yellowed with time, a button from a uniform Eli's son's, a dried daisy, and at the very bottom, a folded piece of paper. Ruth didn't touch it. "She kept this hidden," she said. "She said some things were too precious to show off." Ruth closed the box and set it gently back where she found it. "She must have loved deep." "She did," Eli said. Quiet but steady. Ruth looked at him then, her voice soft. "I didn't think people like that existed." "They do," he said. "But sometimes they don't shout. They build instead." That night, Ruth stayed up after the kids were in bed. She sat by the fire with a stack of lesson books and a piece of worn slate, practicing cursive until her hand cramped. Eli watched from across the room, pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling. "Next spring," she said without looking up, "I take the test. You'll pass. If I don't, you'll try again." She smiled without lifting her eyes. "That simple? That hard, but that simple." In late December, a neighbor stopped by with news. A man from the county someone knew, young, eager, had asked questions about a group of orphans taken in by a widower. Rumors stirred like wind through dry grass. The law, it seemed, hadn't entirely let go. Eli didn't flinch. He went into town the next day, clean shirt, straight back, Ruth's letter of school enrollment in his coat pocket. He walked straight into the office and laid it on the desk. "You got questions?" he said. "Ask 'em now." The man behind the desk blinked, glanced at the papers, nodded slowly. We had a complaint. You also got 6 healthy children who ain't in a home or a jail or a grave. That count for nothing? The man hesitated. It does. Then we're done here. He left without waiting for an answer. That evening he told Ruth what he'd done. She didn't scold him. She didn't say thank you either. Just looked at him the way someone looks at the horizon after too many years staring at the ground. You ever think about the future? She asked. Sometimes. What do you see? He looked at her across the table, where the baby gnawed on a crust of bread, and Clara slept curled in a quilt like a kitten. I see this, he said. More of it. Stronger. Maybe louder. She laughed. I'd like to build on, she said. Add a room. Get a bigger table. I'd like that too. And maybe one day, she started, then stopped. He waited. One day, she said again, quieter, I want someone to say, that's Ruth Cade's place. Not the girl who got taken in. Just mine. He nodded, his voice thick. We'll make it so. Outside, snow finally began to fall. Not heavy, but real. Steady flakes, soft as breath. Inside, Eli stood and stoked the fire. The warmth rising slow. Tomorrow would come, and the one after that. And when spring came again, they'd be ready. Together, the last snow melted in early March, slipping off the roof in slow, deliberate drips that echoed in the rain barrel outside the kitchen door. The ground turned slick and black, boot-sucking and thick, but the air smelled of thaw. The kind of smell that made old bones ache and new roots push a little harder. Eli stepped outside one morning and saw the first sprig of green along the orchard edge, just a weed, nothing more, but still. It made him stop. He remembered Lena planting those trees years ago, hands in the dirt, belly swollen with their first son. They won't be for us, she'd said, laughing. They'll be for the ones who come after. He hadn't understood what she meant then. Now he did. Inside, Ruth had taken to waking before the rest. She liked the quiet hours, the stillness before the house stirred. Her books were always open on the table, notes scrawled in the margins in her neat, careful script. Nora often joined her, head resting on her sister's shoulder, fingers tracing the letters. Eli watched them one morning from the doorway and said nothing. Just watched. Grateful. She passed the teacher's exam 2 weeks later. The town clerk called Eli personally. Never seen someone score that high, he said. That girl's got lightning in her. Eli hung up the phone with his hand trembling. When Ruth came in from milking, he met her at the door. You passed. She didn't speak at first, just closed her eyes and let the words land. I knew you would, he added. She opened her eyes, shining with disbelief. I didn't. Well, you did. The others celebrated the way children do, with yelling and chaos and flour everywhere. Sammy declared they needed a party. Nora made paper crowns out of feed sack. Eli gave Ruth the leather-bound journal Lena had never used. For your classroom, he said, or your stories. Ruth clutched it like a living thing. She didn't cry, but she came close. By April, the first boards were laid for the schoolhouse. It wasn't much, just a one-room space near the edge of the orchard, but the kids helped dig the foundation, haul stone, hammer the frame. Even Thomas toddled out to hand up nails. Neighbors came too, curious at first, then offering lumber, windows, even an old desk someone had kept in a barn. This is Ruth Cade's school, Eli told them, built for our own. That name, Ruth Cade, stuck. Not Miss. Not orphan, not visitor. Cade. Ruth didn't ask for it. He never offered it like a gift. It just became true. That spring, the orchard bloomed so full it looked like snow again. White blossoms hung heavy from every branch, scenting the wind with sweetness. Ruth took her students, her siblings, the neighbor children, even a few boys from the next county outside, to learn under the trees. Eli would watch from the porch as she taught them how to spell river and truth and beginning. He couldn't always hear her words, but he didn't need to. They were safe. They were home. One Sunday, near sunset, Ruth found Eli out by Lena's grave in the orchard. She stood beside him for a while, saying nothing. Then, I never asked why you let us stay. He didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the weathered cross and the fresh blossoms it leaned beneath. Because someone once gave me a place when I didn't deserve one, he said. Figured I'd pass it on. She bent down, picked a small flower, and laid it on the grave. You did more than that. Eli finally turned to her. The wind tugged her hair, pulled at the hem of her dress, but she didn't move. You gave us a life, she said. You made it one, he he replied. They stood there in silence, side by side, as the last light fell through the trees. That night, he handed her a box. Inside was a thin gold band, worn smooth. It was Lena's, he said, but she'd want you to have it. Ruth touched it with care. I'm not married, don't need to be, he said. This ain't about that. It's about who stays, who carries the fire forward. She closed the box, holding it to her chest. Ellie didn't speak. He didn't need to. The house behind them glowed with lamplight and laughter. The land was full again. The past no longer haunted it, watched with pride. And the future? The future had already begun.